Welcome to the 32nd anniversary of the Miami Book Fair. My name is Alicia Giovinazzo. I'm the Academic Dean of the Kendall Campus of Miami-Dade College and your room host and introducer for today's session. We're delighted to have you here with us. Please consider becoming a member of the Friends of the Book Fair if you are not one already. Your contribution will support this wonderful book fair. Friends receive multiple benefits such as preferential seating and admission to special book fair events. We greatly appreciate our friends that are here with us today. You can also support the fair today by texting BOOK, capital B-O-O-K, to 501501 to donate $10. Once you receive a text back, you would just reply yes. We're also grateful to our sponsors, including the Knight Foundation, OHL Arellano, and the Bachelor Foundation, and so many more that are listed on signage throughout the fair. Miami Book Fair does not end tomorrow. Miami Book Fair programs, events, and activities take place throughout the year and all over Miami. We are grateful for the college and the hundreds of volunteers that make it all possible. There will be a brief question and answer after the reading discussion, and the authors will be autographing books immediately after this session. The autographing area is located once you go off the escalators. You do an immediate left, and you will find the autographing area there. Now, kindly silence your cell phones so there will be no interruptions. And here to introduce our special guest authors is Rafael Rosado. So he's not here, and you need to introduce her.
Wonderful. Hello, my name is Ralph Rosado. I'm the president of Rosado & Associates, which is an urban planning and economic development strategy firm working with local cities, and I'm also a professor at FIU. I am thrilled to introduce today's session. So thrilled, in fact, that when my car broke down and I couldn't find the spare and I took Uber and all that, I have made it here, sort of across the county to make sure to be here for this session because Oscar Hijuelos is one of my favorite authors, so I'm absolutely delighted to be here. Oscar Jerome Hijuelos is one of my favorites, as I mentioned. He was born in America to Cuban parents, as so many of us were in this community. And in a week where it's been particularly challenging for immigrants around the country, I think it's one of the things that really sort of casts a positive light on the fact that so many of us are here because of our parents and our grandparents and the decisions that they made, and we've been able to do some pretty amazing things in this country. He was born in 1951 in New York City. His second novel, The Mambo Kings Play Songs of Love, is one of my favorite books. It was a bestseller. It was turned into a movie, and as a result of the quality of the book, it made Oscar the first Hispanic to win the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, which is a major achievement. Oscar passed away unexpectedly in 2013 of a heart attack, way too young. But his legacy and his talent, they live on. Or as Mark Twain, as depicted by Oscar in his most recent book, the posthumously published Twain and Stanley Enter Paradise, says, to begin with, a writer makes books. In that, we are like undertakers, as we put things into places where they will never be touched or changed. Because we've all been touched or changed by Oscar's work, today we're joined by several people with a deep appreciation for his work. Lori Marie Carlson Hijuelos is Oscar's widow and a distinguished author in her own right. Mirta Ojito has been a reporter since 1987 for the Miami Herald, El Nuevo Herald, and New York Times, and she won a 2001 Pulitzer for a series of articles about race in America. Ana Veciana Suarez is a columnist that I read weekly in the Miami Herald, and the author of several books herself. And although she doesn't know me personally, I actually was neighbor to the Veciana family in Little Havana, and was a classmate and still a friend with her sister Ciras.
Oh, wow.
Yes, so it's a pretty small world. And finally, I don't know that I can quite read this, so there's one more introduction that I need to make. Dr. Echora?
No.
Oh, wonderful. Joanne Maria Yaro from Prometeo Theater, which I've actually been a patron of a number of times, of course, here with the college itself. So we are very, very, very pleased that you're all able to be here today, and we expect a phenomenal session. Thank you. Yes.
So we decided to start with a reading, and it was very interesting, the introduction, because that's the reading I'm starting with. To begin with, a writer makes books. In that we are undertakers. We put things into places that they will never be touched or changed, a kind of timeless limbo or heaven, to be more cheerful about it. We are like those Swiss tinkerers who fidget around little gears and make clocks. For each book, whether novel or travel log, history or memoir, ticks according to its own time. Its gears run perpetually as long as there is someone to wind it up and scan his eyes over its creamy papers. The beauty of it all, as Stanley has pointed out, is that books will last as long as there are men to read them, far longer than any one individual. Shakespeare's gone, and so is Cervantes. Their bones have long since turned to dust, and yet their books bring them back. Even now, as I speak, the youthful Cervantes, a prisoner of the Ottoman Empire after the Battle of Lepanto, sits in a cell in some dank Muslim dungeon in Constantinople, dreaming up Don Quixote. Shakespeare, drinking ale in a tavern in Stratford-upon-Avon, looks up and sees the face of Ophelia in the tavern keeper's buxom's daughter. One idea leads to another, a single expression, a moment, a patch of thoughts amounting to one splendiferous idea or person. Added up and written down, they become a book. What books I make, any of us makes, are expendable in the face of actual rumblings of history, yet without them, imagine how dull and listless life would be. Think about it, a world without books, with nothing to remind us of how other men thought and lived. I've once dreamed of such a world, and the very thought of it left me so gloomy I could not speak to anyone for days and was only resuscitated by reading Carlyle's History of the French Revolution. Books, I then concluded, are my water, my evening and morning meal, my sunlight and garden, and what words spill from my pencil are my gestures of thanks for that fact.
So we don't really have a moderator, so we'll moderate ourselves. And I think we want to begin by remember Oscar, which is the reason why we're here. First of all, thank you for being here. We know that the fair gets bigger and better every year, and that there's a lot of competition for your time, so we thank you. I am personally humbled to be here, and frankly was surprised when I got the call. I cannot call myself a friend of Oscar, but I can call myself a fan, an admirer, and someone who sought him out twice for help with my books, Finding Mañana and Hunting Season, and I asked him, would you please give me the blurb for the back of the book? Writers are always in the position to go begging for that all-important blurb, and of course, the bigger name you can get on the cover of your book, the better it is. And I don't know what possessed me to ask Oscar for the first time, because I thought, he was so big, he was so out there, while I was just beginning, and it was my first book. And he said yes, and he gave me a beautiful quote. Others said no, they were too busy, and they are. Writers are extremely busy. But I don't know how he always found the time. He was incredibly kind. I know to all, but he was especially, I felt, kind to me because I was just beginning. And then I asked him again for my second book, Hunting Season. And I happen to have the book here with me because I was presenting this book today, and I was reading it. Compelling and complex, told with the authority of a much-respected journalist whose own experience as an immigrant lends this book the depth, insights, and poignancy that only someone of her experience can convincingly and rightfully convey. And in the other book, he actually cited a chapter, chapter 9. So I know he read the books. So many of these blurbs are must read, terrific book, great debut, and he actually took the time to read the books. And I always remember that when I moved to New York, the second time in 2006, it's not in my nature to miss cities. I miss people, not cities. So I was missing my Cuban tribe from Miami. And I had a neighbor who was and is a pianist, also a professor at Columbia. And she said, we should have like a Cuban tertulia here. And I said, yes. And you had just published your book, remember that? And I said, well, we have to have this with, somebody who can actually read. We need a book, we need a Cuban book. So Lori and Oscar came to my neighbor's house. We were living door to door, just a block and a half away from Columbia. And we had somebody play the piano and they read. And it was just a wonderful, beautiful night. We did not take pictures. No, we didn't. But there was an illustrator there from Time Magazine, Edel Rodriguez, who by coincidence came in the Mariel boat lift, as I did. And he sat there very quietly all night. I didn't know what he was doing. And at the end of the night, he gave me the book as a gift. And what he was doing was drawing everyone. So I have these amazing drawings of the night. And I should have brought them. I should have brought that today because that book it's on my desk. I have it opened on that page. And I look at it when I need to remember what a generous writer is like or was like, and what a good person he was. Not to mention the endless hours of pleasure, pure pleasure, that he's giving me and so many of us through his literature, which is truly what makes him immortal. I personally felt his death in a very deep and personal way, and I'm honored to be here today and to be remembering him with Lori.
Well, I thought I'd talk a little bit about Oscar as the man I eventually met, and then as the author, and then I met Lori afterwards on one of the times he was down here. The first time I met him, I had this vision of what he would be like. I had read Mambo Kings, and anybody who has read that imagines the author in a certain way, or I did. And I came to find out, and I was a little nervous because I had to introduce him at Books and Books and so on. And to me, the one thing that surprised me was how shy he was. He was really a shy man. So to see Oscar on the page and Oscar in living flesh was such a contrast. But I think to me, the importance was not only, and I brought all the books of his that I could find here. So I've got, of course, Mambo Kings, A Simple and a Melody, one of his latest, his memoir, and so on. So I brought them all just to kind of give me a little support. But I think his legacy for writers, especially Latino writers, was invaluable. Remember when his book came out and went on to win the Pulitzer, I had always entertained kind of the idea that, I loved fiction. I was a journalist by training, but I really loved fiction. And this is how I would spend any free time I had, as any good friend or family member knows, is with my nose in a book. And it was very hard for my family to understand that. I come from a family of accountants and doctors, so I don't think they have a iota of blood of creativity. So this was, just, kind of like, you want to do what? So here was a Cuban American who he really defined himself as an American Cuban, which was always very interesting, who had written this incredible book, was very successful, and it also the movie came out, which, a lot of people remember the movie, because I think Antonio Banderas was in it, at the same time that another Cuban-American writer had published, Cristina Garcia had published Dreaming in Cuban. So there were all these things happening in the late 80s and the beginning 90s. And I think he opened the doors for a lot of writers who were dreaming and who could look up and think this was possible. So for me, it was that kind of contrast of somebody who wrote, and it wasn't just writing about the Cuban-American experience or the Hispanic experience, because Oscar really had this kind of incredible intellect. He was curious about everything, and he was always asking questions. But it was, this contrast of this very shy man who was very uncomfortable in public to a certain degree, and this incredibly bold, aggressive, sexual writer, sensual, I guess would be the better word. So that's really what I want to contribute at this point, and the kind of the contrast.
Just to riff off of that in a way, to give the audience some insight into my husband's life and the way he thought and what we dealt with through the years with fame and his success. The idea and the notion that Oscar was this incredibly bold, sexual, aggressive guy because of the Mambo Kings is just so unworthy of who he really was. He was a very introspective, tender, quiet, as you said, shy man. And I remember when Oscar was experiencing the first taste of fame and success, we would go often to parties, to receptions, to dinners. People were inviting us constantly to their homes and to fancy occasions. And one night we were at someone's very beautiful home on Fifth Avenue, and somebody was posing as Oscar, going around the room saying that he was Oscar Hijuelos. So when somebody happened to come up to Oscar at one point and was talking to him and said, "Well, who are you?" And Oscar said, "Oscar Hijuelos." "Oh, no, I've already met Oscar Hijuelos." And, there was this guy who was sort of a typical Cuban-looking man, very sexy, dark-haired, tall guy, and there was Oscar with a little smile on his face, accepting this with grace, as he was wont to do. Another, maybe a little anecdote that you might enjoy, when Oscar won the Pulitzer, when Mambo Kings was published, Oscar was told by his editor at Farrar, Straus and Giroux that it was highly unlikely the novel would do anything, that it probably wouldn't sell because books about Latinos, and this was back in 1989, didn't work commercially. So Oscar and I had just started to date, although we had known one another a long time. He decided to get out of town, and he went to Portugal because he couldn't deal with the stress. And when he came back, of course, he discovered that the book was getting incredible notice and all of these blurbs. And I would be on the bus every morning opening the New York Times, and there was a full-page ad for Mambo Kings with these incredible endorsements. And anyway, Oscar had to go on a tour to England to promote the book, and he was exhausted, and it was just before Good Friday. It was Maundy, Thursday. And we were staying at a friend's house upstate, and he was really kind of down. And I said, "Let's go antiquing." So we got up early, we went to this little cafe in the country, and I looked at Oscar and I said, "When are the Pulitzers announced?" And he said, "Why would you ask that?" And I said, "Because you're going to win." And he said, "Lori, how dare you do that to me? That is so cruel." You know, here I didn't win the National Book Award, I didn't win Books Critics Circle Award, and you're telling me I'm going to win? I said, "You are going to win the Pulitzer Prize, my dear." We got back from antiquing. We walked into the house and the phone was ringing, and it was Oscar's agent, Harriet. She said, "Lori, you and Oscar have to stay put. Don't move." 10 minutes later, the phone rang again. It was Oscar's publisher telling him he had just won the Pulitzer. Yeah.
That's one of the last anecdotes that I remember from his memoir. It's in Thoughts Without Cigarettes. And I always wondered why he ended the book there. It's pretty much the end of the book.
Yeah, because the editor, Bill Schinker, who's also a publisher, wanted Oscar to talk about how a young kid who grew up in impoverished circumstances made it. And he thought it would be the right cutoff if it culminated in Oscar's success. And I know that Oscar was planning on writing a sequel.
Oh,
Yeah. But that will be left to me now.
are you going to?
I'll write a memoir about our life together.
That's the best news I've heard today.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think we should talk about this book, which you've read. I'm halfway through, and I'm always taken by, the first time I met Oscar, which was a long time ago. I think it was 1999. The New York Times, where I worked then, had just started a series of events which they called Times Talks. And I think he was, and then they created a Latino Talks. And so they asked me who I wanted to interview, and I said, Oscar, of course. I think it was Empress of the Splendid Season had just come out, a book that I absolutely loved. Loved that book. And I called him, I don't know how, but we ended up meeting at a bar, of all places. I don't think I'd ever met anyone at a bar for an interview, but we did near Times Square. He was, of course, very kind immediately, shy, but very kind, very open. And we, of course, talked about identity. And he defined himself as a writer, a New Yorker, writer from New York of Cuban parents and all that. And I thought, well, that's good, because that's exactly what he is. And yet, Cuba was always there. It was never, it was just, in some books in the periphery, in others very much central, but always there. And I began to read this book, and it's just one of the first phrases I found, page 46, in Havana, Cuba, a land he called beautiful. He always had this sense of the beauty and the danger of Cuba because of, and I'll let Lori talk about that because to me it was so poignant, but it's, if you read his memoir, or Our House in the Last World for that matter, you'll see that Cuba for him was always this dual thing. It was a dichotomy because on the one hand it gave him pleasure because he loved everything that was beautiful. On the other one, it gave him a terrible disease that almost killed him. So he was torn between those two things, I felt. But his, immediately after, on page 87, the description of the arrival of this, the protagonist in Cuba is just a beautiful description of the Bay. And on and on. I mean, I kept marking it and then finally stopped. Just hearing the clipped locutions of your Spanish, of which I had only a fledgling knowledge. That was also part of it always, right? How he had forgotten Spanish. But anyway, I just think that Cuba was, to me, is the paradise in the book, in the title of the book.
It's interesting about the Spanish thing with Oscar because he didn't forget it. He could understand anybody who spoke fluent Spanish. And if he happened to be in a relaxed mood, he was as eloquent as could be. I remember he was interviewed at the Library of Congress, Alberto, by some newsmen, and he was magnificent. He was answering every question in Spanish perfectly without any errors. And also, was a very curious thing, he would speak in his sleep in absolutely incredible Cuban Spanish with that intonation like his mother. I remember one night I woke up, I could hear, and it was Oscar going on and on, pero hombre, and it was just, a typical Cuban. So whatever is going on there in the brain, I think that he might have, in some ways, because he was so shy and because his standards were so high, I think he felt that he was inadequate.
Probably.
And
The fledglings. That's what the way he describes it for them. too.
even though he wasn't, he felt it so much in
Right.
everything, actually.
Right, right.
Lori, I'd like to ask you a question because, and I was telling Mirta this, that when I had finished the book, but before I finished, I thought, wow, what, all this research of where did he find these letters? And then come to find out that he made everything up. When you're reading this, you think that the letters and the diaries he's quoting from are actual research. And I think that speaks to how he wrote. He wrote with authority. He owned what he wrote. And it didn't matter whether he was writing, a simple Havana melody or Empress of the Splendid. It didn't matter. He just owned whatever material he wrote about. And I, as a fellow writer, I think that's the biggest compliment I can give another writer, because to be such, to come off in that way. But I think it also speaks to the fact of how meticulous he was about everything.
This was 12 years in the making, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it was 12 years in the writing, but probably 20 years in the making, because he did so much research, and he was reading about these characters for a long time, since he was in his teens. So, what was going on in his mind and his brain, simmering all the time, concocting this tale.
I know you and I talked before the book was published, and it was exactly when you had already made the decision to publish the book.
Right.
How soon after his death did you find the manuscript and decided that you wanted to publish it?
Yeah. So I knew that Oscar had completed the novel, but that he continued to rewrite and write new versions of it, and he just couldn't help himself. He probably wrote 4 versions. My living room is full of boxes now, and I've got, according to the archivist, more than 3,000 pages for this novel. Oscar had a studio, I have still the studio in our co-op building on another floor. And it was his sacred space, and the only time I ever was in that sacred space was to decorate it and to have it painted and renovated. And so I have not been in the studio since Oscar occupied it, meaning 15 years, 16, 17 years now. I still cannot go in there. So I sent a film crew to go to his studio shortly after he died for posterity, because I intend to make a documentary of Oscar's life. And I wanted to make sure that everything was intact before people started moving things around. And I told my film crew to look for bound manuscripts. And I said, I know it's somewhere. I don't know if you'll find it, but if you do, you've got to give me a call as soon as you do. And sure enough, he called me and brought it up, and I took it in my arms to my heart and wept. It was only 3 months after Oscar had died. And I told my agent that I wanted her to arrange for me to meet with editors in New York, and that from these meetings I would select the final editor for Oscar's book. And it was one Gretchen Young at Hachette who won me over with her passion. So that's really how it came to be.
That was a great question. We should open it up to questions from the audience.
I have a question.
Me
I'll be
too.
on the
I have many. but-
Lori, music was a big, big part, from his youth. If you could talk a little bit about that. And I think a lot of the cadence of his language was certainly influenced by his love of music and everything else. So I thought maybe you could talk a little bit.
Well, it's hard to know whether or not I should say that Oscar was a musical novelist or a novelistic musician. He loved both equally, music and writing. There was not one day that went by that Oscar did not either play his guitar or play the piano. He was self-taught. He could not live without music. And I remember when we first married, I would get up in the morning and make breakfast, and he would come in later, and the only time he ever criticized me was if I didn't have on classical music. So I learned that was the very first thing I had to do, is put on classical music in the morning before I made him breakfast. He was just born gifted that way. His mom was musical. She sang. She, I think, played a little guitar in her youth. But music, he just simply could not live without music. He was a collector, so I also have a huge collection of guitars that I have to figure out what to do with. Beautiful guitars we bought in Spain and Latin America. And he loved rock, so Lou Reed was one of his best friends, and Lou would come over and jam with Oscar often, and come to listen to Oscar play because he admired him so much. He thought he was extraordinary. Yeah. Well, actually, the genesis for the novel was Oscar's passion for Stanley. And he read the first biography he could find about Stanley when he was 17. And I think what it was is that Oscar related to the idea that this young boy who came from nothing, who was an orphan, made a life for himself, all by himself, with nothing but his passion, his creativity, his robust brain power, and also his prowess, his physical prowess. Stanley was a little guy, but look what he did. He went to not that everything he did was kosher or will be thought of kindly by the history books, but he was able to do extraordinary feats and deal with malaria and the unknown. Mullah Butari, smasher of stones, was his nickname. And I think Oscar related to that because he was a sickly child. He nearly died from nephritis. He came from poverty without any encouragement from his family to do or to be. It was all Oscar. And Oscar was somebody who liked to test his limits and who liked to surpass what he felt was normal. So because for instance, he was afraid of heights, so he forced himself to go to Tibet and trek in the Himalayas. And I have spoken to several of his companions on these trips, and they told me he was just a bulldog. You know, he would not, he felt sick, he, you know, was experiencing all kinds of problems, but he just forged ahead, inch by inch. And apparently some of the party in front of them had died, they fell off, and Oscar knew it, but he kept going. That, you know, and I think that's what he admired in Stanley. Obviously, Twain, being one of the greatest American writers ever, was somebody to whom he paid homage. You know, he would have liked to aspire to be a great writer like Twain. Well, I never heard Oscar say that.
Oh, I
he
thought you
wants
just,
that kind of, yeah, I said that. I remember that clearly because he said that, and I had never thought of it in that way, and I really don't know, except that maybe because he was born here, he didn't speak Spanish, although I thought in the few times that I, you know, talked to him personally that his Spanish had improved. Would you?
Well,
Say that
you see, if he were relaxed, he could speak very beautiful Spanish. It's a very curious thing about him. He got nervous when he was being judged by fellow Cubans. That's what really set him off. But you know, think about it. Oscar was not somebody who came here from Cuba in his teens. He was born in the United States. His, you know, it's a different matter. And the fact that he felt so attached to his parents and his grandparents and his extended family's culture, I think says a lot about Oscar's heart and where his head was, because he didn't have to. You know, a lot of, I'm the daughter of, well, not immigrants, but my grandparents were from Sweden and Italy. I don't speak Italian, I don't speak Swedish. I don't write about Italy, I don't write about Sweden. No, he was very proud of his Cuban roots. Very.
And our final question.
was he surprised by his success?
I think he felt extraordinarily grateful for his success. He knew how difficult it is to make a living from writing, and he did. And he didn't have to do anything else but write. Surprised, and probably surprised too, because let's face it, the vast majority of Americans aren't interested in Latin American or Latino writing. That's my experience. I mean, this is my field. When I go to readings that feature Latinos, it's usually Latinos in the audience. It's very rare that you see Swedes, Germans, Irish in there, you know? So, yeah.
This has been a great session. I know that before we wrap up, I should mention that all of our authors will be signing their books downstairs immediately after the session, and we have one final reading.
I just want to say before I read, thank you so much for being here and sharing these stories. And it's so wonderful to have that feeling. And it's just like we just finished reading. It's like Shakespeare. His work just keeps going on, and he comes alive every time you read his books. And I really, really recommend to everyone to get this book. It is just a delicious ride. It's just a wonderful journey. So thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to read a second chapter between the two characters. It's actually a memory of Twain's. When contemplating the private sexual life of a man, especially famous men such as Stanley and himself, Clemens recalled a conversation he had once with Stanley, God bless his soul, regarding the untarnished image of David Livingstone. They were at Richmond Terrace on a Sunday in 1899 when Dolly, Gertrude, and Livy had gone off to church. That Stanley had remained behind to partake of a leisurely breakfast with Clemens had surprised him. How is it that you, of a most pious bent of mine are abstaining from the service. Oh, my church is here, he said, touching his heart. Besides, I did not want to leave you alone. I would have been fine. That is so. The truth is, Samuel, as often as I have spoken to church groups from the pulpits, I'm tired of the stuffy doings of the services. Here, have some champagne, and Stanley poured him a glass. Isn't it a bit early? Samuel, if you must know, given a period of sound health, I begin every morning with a glass of champagne, followed by a shot of brandy, in the Spanish fashion. It brightens my spirits, and in its way brings me closer to God than any dreary service. In fact, if I have attended church at all in recent times, it is because of Denzel, but I mainly leave it to Dolly and Miss Tennant to take him. As I think a boy should know about such practices, I allow it. You see, Samuel, even though I was raised in that way and had a salubrious teachings rammed down my throat at a boy at St. Asaph's, my once naive views on divinity and the necessity of churches have long since become artifacts of the past. But when we first knew each other, you were different. Yes, I would say so. But I was then an innocent to the world. We both were. Now, tell me, Stanley, do you really believe in God? That great subject. Before addressing it, let me fill your glass. Cheers. But do you believe it, Stanley? To be truthful, Samuel, even as we sit here, I do. And I do not. Which is to say that at the highest pitch moments of belief, it has sometimes slipped away from me. And yet, I have still always aligned myself with the faith. I suppose because of a few encounters with truly devout men. My father, Mr. Stanley, was one of them, as you know, but even his influence faded gradually with the passing years. How could it not when I have seen so much carnage? But then, as such things have a way of working themselves out, just when my faith was at its lowest ebb, and I was as cynical and selfish as any man can be, it was my destiny to know Dr. Livingston. If you have read my books about him, I have, Henry, then you will know of the profound change in my person that transpired. But here is a twist. While in his company, I saw that even the most pious of men, like Livingston, can have a side that seems contradictory to the usual expressions of belief in a Christian God. How so? A little bit of history for you. In all his years of wandering through Central Africa, Livingston's survival often depended upon his honoring of local tribal customs and becoming a blood brother with the chieftains, which I did many times myself. But Livingston, it has been said, also took concubines among the native women. The queens of these tribes thought him possessed of special powers because he was a white man and would, as the Bible might say, lie down with him. This was considered a special honor, and he, to stay in their good graces, could not refuse it. But if these rumors are true, he had no problem with this practice, for Livingston would have put such sensate activities as, well, to put it bluntly, copulation into the same category as eating and digestion, a bodily affair. To say the least, one kept separate from the effort to bring Christ's teachings to the savages. In that way, Livingston was of two minds, but his religious side was so great and inspiring that after I had gone slogging through the swamps and jungles to reach him, and had despaired so often in my malarial states that I thought God a bit of a myth, it was his faith that revived my own. Mind you, He was an endlessly restless man, a foot tapper, like me. Even when he tried to sit still, how else could he have trekked through uncharted regions for so many years? That energy and his appetites were one side of him. The other, the religious, was absolutely serene. He hung on to his faith even after his wife, even watching his wife die of malaria in Africa, just a few months after she had arrived to join him in his missionary work. One would think he would have resented the idea of God then, but he did not. And when he died, after years of solitude in some desolate village in the Congo, he was found pitched face forward to the ground, his hands held in an attitude of prayer. Now, dear Samuel, if he was an undeniably great man, a much greater man than I, who am I to dismiss his final opinion? And so it is that even when I have little faith, his influence changes my mind. Do you suppose he was praying to clear himself for Judgment Day? Possibly. And the afterlife, Stanley? Now, I know you don't believe in it. As for me, when I am in my cups, I will say there is one. But in my everyday waking life, I don't imagine it exists, although I don't really care at heart. As much as I have come to love certain human beings, I think the human race so despicable that I almost welcome the idea of having no more dealings with it. I am with you on that. But who is to say, said Stanley, filling Clement's glass with more champagne. What I most often believe, dear friend, is that what awaits me will be a merciful darkness. That cheers me up, Clement says. As you and I are sitting here on this beautiful morning, another sacred day commemorating the heresy about the risen Christ, I remain as skeptical as I have ever been. Much as I have tried lately to put on a good face about all that business for Livy. Simply put, I am a reluctant atheist, and as much as I wish it were otherwise, it is so. Thank you. Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you all three panelists for being here and for being a part of the book fair, and they will be signing autographs downstairs. Thanks.
Nothing to sign.